Good afternoon and welcome. We're delighted to have you here today. My name is John Mitchell and I serve as Executive Director and CEO here at Arden Wood. We're also happy to welcome people online. We are streaming this meeting today, and so we're delighted to have all of you online with us, wherever you are. Before we get underway, I want to mention just a few things. First, a big thank you to Amelia West and all the volunteers that helped today. We have quite an audience, and we're delighted to have you all here and grateful for all of our wonderful volunteers. Second, we have 2 key job openings here at Arden Wood. I didn't want to waste this opportunity. We're looking for a Director of Personnel and Support Services, and that person oversees our HR needs. Some of you didn't know that Tricia will be leaving, but we're going to miss her. She wants to return back to her Oregon. So we'll miss you, Tricia. So we're looking for that position. So if you know of anyone, we're also looking for a front desk receptionist. So we're looking for individuals with the appropriate experience and a deep love for Christian Science. One of the benefits is the lovely employee apartments we have on site. So please check our website at ardenwood.org for details. On a different note, if you or someone you know is looking for a new sense of home or community, we'd love you to consider becoming a resident in our independent living program. You're invited to come and see this community in action. What that means is you can come for 2 days and 2 nights on us and just check it out. So please look into it, and anyone who is interested, also please go online, and we'd love to have Diane Spear be in touch with you. Tours of Arden Wood are available after today's talk. We'll be leaving from the front desk at 3:30, and I'll be leading the tour, so I hope you can join us for that. Finally, I want to sincerely thank you all for your contributions to Arden Wood. You make our work possible, and we are deeply grateful. Your generous support is greatly needed at this time, right now. We're a 501c3 charitable nonprofit organization, so your contributions are tax deductible and make a real difference. So we hope that you'll support us. And now, let me introduce our speaker, Janet Horton. I've been looking forward to this day since May of 2013 when I first met Janet. I've been picturing this day. But before I do that, I thought this might be helpful. A lot of people really don't know what the chaplaincy is about. So I just went to Go Army. Just let me read you what a chaplain is before I introduce our speaker. It says, a glorious past, a powerful present, and a challenging future. Established by the Second Continental Congress in 1775, the Army chaplaincy predates the Declaration of Independence. We're a little bit loud, if we can turn it down just a little bit. Predates the Declaration of Independence and is both the largest and oldest military chaplaincy in the world. More than 25,000 chaplains have served since then in 36 wars and 242 major combat engagements. 6 were awarded the nation's highest military award for valor, the Medal of Honor. Many former Army chaplains have served in prominent positions of government, education, and religion. Today, as in the past, chaplains serve a great variety of positions and places throughout the world. While their methods of ministry may change with the transformation of the battlefield, their ministry and message are timeless and immeasurable. No matter what your faith group, the Army chaplaincy offers various ways for you to serve both God and your country, from providing support to unit ministry teams as a chaplain assistant to caring for the spiritual well-being of soldiers and their families as an Army chaplain. You'll discover the opportunities are as varied as they are unique. And Janet will tell us more about the chaplaincy, but I thought that was a little background. In thinking about Janet, 2 quotes from the Old and New Testament come clearly to mind from when I first saw you. To me, they capture her essence. From Isaiah, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Then said I, "Here am I. "Send me." And from James, "Show me thy faith without thy works, and I will show thee my faith by my works." Janet Yarlett Horton served as a chaplain in the United States Army, achieving the rank of colonel. She retired in 2004 and has been teaching and giving inspiring talks ever since. Her Midwestern roots are in Michigan and Iowa. She brings years of education to her work, including 2 master's degrees, one in ethics and theology from Boston University, and another in religious studies from Stanford. She entered the United States Army in June of 1976 as a chaplain and was the first woman assigned as a division or corps chaplain. She later became the first woman to be promoted to colonel in the Army Chaplain Corps. Colonel, as you know, is just one notch below the rank of general. Janet's spirit and her hard work stood out. She received the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit twice, Meritorious Service Medal 4 times, Army Commendation Medal twice. Janet was at the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001, also known as 9/11. She subsequently advised the Department of Defense on Islamic issues and the terrorist mindset. She's also presented briefings to U.S. governmental interagencies, the State Department, U.S. Marshal's Office, the Defense Intelligence Agency, to name just a few. Currently, Janet is the endorser and trainer for the Mother Church for all Christian Science military chaplains and trainees at Boston University's School of Theology. Janet's talk today is entitled "The Birth of a New Idea." There'll be time for question and answers afterward. What we'll do is when she finishes, we'll stand up just for a minute. If you have any questions, we'll pass them to the aisle. We'll take them, I'll give them to her, and we'll sit back down again. So please write them down, and we'll collect them. And now, please join me in warmly welcoming Janet Horton.
Thank you so much. Being Christian Scientist, I like to go right to Mrs. Setty's writings and start there. So I'm going to start with a quotation from Miscellany. That's page 286. "For many years, I have prayed daily that there be no more war, no more barbarous slaughtering of our fellow beings. Prayed that all the peoples on earth and the islands of the sea have one God, one mind, love God supremely, and love their neighbor as themselves. National disagreements can be and should be arbitrated wisely, fairly, and fully settled. It is unquestionable, however, that at this hour the armament of navies is necessary for the purpose of preventing war and preserving peace among nations." So when people think about, how did Mrs. Setty think about people being even in the military, some people have read some of the things she wrote about pacifism, and she was very much someone who thought pacifism was the way to go, but she realized in that day and age that the armament of navies was probably necessary. And so when you think about, here we have a church that's a lay church, Christian Scientists, and now we're talking about we're going to have military chaplains. So I refer to that as the birth of a new idea. And partially because I think anytime you have a really new idea presented, some people have labor pains with it. So it seems to me to be a pretty good analogy to refer to. And it was interesting because Kim Chouette wrote a book on the history of the military ministries, and so he traced the history back. And he noted that in 1915, the editors took a stance against pacifism, supporting national policy with its call to arms. In 1917 was when the Christian Science Church was actually invited to be part of the military chaplaincy. And they created a whole new term for those few chaplains, and they used the term chaplain at large. And before that, there was only a tiny number of churches that were allowed to have military chaplains. And early on, back in the Constitution, pre-Constitution even, whenever the militia was activated, their local pastor would just go with them, but they weren't considered to be what the military calls a non-combatant. Now they would take their rifle with them and go, and they were they were right there with their soldiers and fighting. So there was a point at which chaplains were considered non-combatants, and by Geneva Convention cannot bear arms. So they have a very special designation in the military. So in 1917 there were five folks that were allowed to have one single chaplain, and that was the Christian Scientists, Mormons, all of the Hebrews in the military were allowed to have one rabbi, Eastern Catholic and the Salvation Army were allowed to have that one chaplain at large. And if you looked at that history, there was an amazing healing. At that time, nerve gas was being put on people in the conflict, and so it was not common to hear that a soldier had been in that kind of nerve gas. And when the Christian Science chaplain found out that one of his Christian Scientists had been affected by the nerve gas, he began and back then you didn't have a Jeep or anything, so he began to try to get his way back to the hospital where this Christian Scientist had been evacuated, and was treating him and giving him Christian Science treatment. And so one of the things we refer to our military chaplains is practitioners in uniform, because he began to do that Christian Science treatment as he began to work his way back to where that young man had been medically evacuated. And by the time he got there, the guy was already healed and had left and gone back to his unit. So he set a pretty high standard there right off to begin with. What I then refer to as anytime there's a birth of a new idea, it has very humble beginnings. As I said, for Christian Science, initially we were only allowed one chaplain. In 1936 to 1946, of course, what was happening in the world historically, they knew that there was going to be huge numbers of people activated into the military. And of course, there was still a draft at those times, and people were expected to go. And so Christian Scientists were allowed to serve, but it was a very different concept at that time. Prior to that, you basically served people of your own tradition. And when I say tradition, I mean denomination. And so, but at that time, they made a radical change in their thought, and they designated there were Catholic priests, and then everybody else was called a Protestant chaplain. And part of that is because these chaplains were embedded right in the units with the soldiers, and so wherever those soldiers went, that you couldn't say, okay, I need a Catholic priest in here, or I need a person who's only Lutheran, or I need a person who's a specific denomination. That chaplain who was with the unit would do everything the unit did. If it was marching somewhere, that chaplain marched there, and so it was he at that time, went through everything that those soldiers went through. And so they began to think of them as their chaplain. And so denomination began to matter less and less. And what chaplains were basically encouraged to do was you would never violate your conscience and do something in the ministry that you wouldn't do in your own ministry, but you were there to also meet the needs of the soldier that you were in. And it wasn't just the Army, the sailors, it would be airmen and eventually Marines. So there's kind of a two-way street there. You're going to be there to meet your own needs of your church, but you're also going to meet the needs of the individual. And one of the examples I give of that is on 9/11 when we were in the Pentagon and the plane hit the building, the firemen were bringing out the casualties and laying them on the grass. And there were only 3 of us chaplains who got in there, and so there were only 3 denominations represented, a Baptist, a Christian Scientist, and the other guy was another type of Baptist. But, I mean, I prayed with a woman who was a Catholic, and so when we prayed the Lord Prayer and held hands, I called it the Our Father, simply because that's the manner in which she would refer to that prayer. And all of us talked afterwards, and we were struck by 2 things. The first thing was there was not a single person who was brought out that was a casualty who said, no, I don't want to pray. And that was very striking to us. And then the second thing you would do in the military, so you understand the chaplaincy, is then you ask that person, what is your tradition, so that you would try to pray in a manner that was meaningful to them. And so they would tell you what their tradition was. And then you would decide, are we going to do the Our Father, are we going to do the Lord's Prayer, or whatever. We were struck that everybody that we prayed with that day were Christians, so there wasn't a huge jump that you had to make, because there was no way to get an imam in there for the Muslims, or there was no way to get a Buddhist in there for a Buddhist. But we did not have that need that day. But so what you do is you do two things. You either provide the ministry if you can, if it's another Christian or whatever. Perform I used the wrong word, perform the thing that they need done if they want to pray or if they want a service of some sort. Then you're going to perform it. If you cannot perform that right, and it is, say, a Muslim, then you make sure that you can provide for their needs by coordinating to get an imam to that location. On 9/11, of course, we didn't have that luxury to do that quickly, but in a military operation, they try to take a great variety of chaplains and put them into those operations so that you can coordinate to get the rabbi downrange for Passover. And in Bosnia, I know I flew down with the rabbi he was going to do Passover, and I did the Easter sermon. So it's wonderful how the military really wants to be attentive and try to meet everybody's needs. And if you can't do that yourself as the chaplains, then what you sometimes have to do, if you don't have a Mormon chaplain there, then you're going to find a civilian soldier who might be a Mormon, who would be what's called your lay denominational leader. And sometimes Christian Scientists do that, and so they would be what are called military ministers. But those people are not the officers that a military chaplain is. They actually become an officer in the military. Before, as I said, in the old days, before 1912, the person would come and have their gun and be the neighbor, but you actually become a military officer when you go into the military now to be a chaplain. So it's quite a commitment. And it was in 1936 through 1946 that they also instituted an educational requirement. So before that, if you were a lay tradition, you didn't have to have a seminary degree. But since then, every single military chaplain, regardless of whether your church would require it or not, has to have that Master's of Divinity. So because Boston University School of Theology is very close to the mother church there, our chaplains have always gone to Boston University. And then we bring them over on Fridays because they don't have classes on Fridays. And we go right to the metaphysics and go right back to the books and prepare them the way we would prepare them as a Christian Scientist. So you see, it's kind of different as time went on and got more and more complicated. In the mid-70s then was when women were introduced. And I refer to that as the birth of a new idea too, because birth is something kind of common to women. And again, they had some labor pains with that. So each case, what you found was each case was individual. And a lot of people, when I share experience that I've had, and it was a challenging experience, they'll say, well, now, did that person resist you because you were a Christian Scientist or because you were a woman? And I said, well, you know, when that guy spit on me, he didn't say, excuse me, I'm spitting on you because you're a woman, or I'm spitting on you because you were a Christian Scientist. So, or it could be both. And so Christian Science chaplains, you know, it's not like they get a card from the person and the person saying, this is why I kind of pushed back on you. Because to many folks, they need to understand what Christian Science is about. So we're not only practitioners in uniform, but a lot of people learn about Christian Science because of the Christian Scientist in the military. For me, when I started out the chaplaincy, there were two very important metaphysical ideas that I worked with. The first one is from page 235 in Science and Health. Clergymen occupying the watchtowers of the world should uplift the standard of truth. They should raise their hearers spiritually, that their listeners will love to grapple with a new right idea and broaden their concepts. Love of Christianity, rather than love of popularity, should stimulate clerical labor and progress. Truth should emanate from the pulpit, but never be strangled there. A special privilege is vested in the ministry. How shall it be used? Sacredly, in the interest of humanity and not of sect. So this idea, to me, here she starts right out saying that listeners will love to grapple with a new right idea and broaden their concepts. The other thing that prepared me, I thought, to go into the military chaplaincy was from page 450 in Science and Health, lines 15 to 22. And this had to do with how challenging this new idea of Christian Scientists being chaplains, and then add in the woman issue. Some people yield slowly to the touch of truth. Few yield without a struggle, and many are reluctant to acknowledge that they have yielded. But unless the admission is made, evil will boast itself above good. The Christian Scientist has enlisted to lessen evil, disease, and death, and he will overcome them by understanding their nothingness and the allness of God good. So that was where the metaphysical ideas that the type of thing we studied when we were over at the Mother Church when we were in seminary, and we really talked about the beauty of the ideas Mrs. Setti had for elevating the concept of the ministry to people. For me, I remember I'm from Iowa, so people frequently refer to me who know me as Pollyanna from Iowa. And so I was pretty naive when I got interested in the military, but growing up, I could have never even thought I could do anything like that. I was so shy, and I know at this time in my life this will be a shock to people who know me, but at that time I was so shy I could not look another human being in the eyes. And so one day I was praying about that, and I was at school. We'd moved from Michigan to Iowa, and I remember a young man that I had a crush on, and I'm about 12 or 13 years old at the time. I walked up behind him as somebody was saying to him, you know, that new girl has a crush on you. And of course he said, well, who is she? And you know, that really new smart girl. And he goes, well, women who are walking encyclopedias should remember that textbooks are never taken out. And so I went home that night and I cried, you know, and I wasn't shy enough, but this was about it, you know. So I remember thinking, I couldn't stop crying, and then the thought came to me, and it's interesting how many times as you learn things, the answer you get from God is that voice of rebuke, because the voice said, this is nothing more than selfishness. And as shy as I was, I remember thinking, boy, that's the last thing on earth I would have thought I'd heard. And then the voice said, no, if you think people are always constantly looking at you and criticizing your modest dress, and that I was the size of second graders in sixth grade, and so, you know, I was so teensy that people would often say, oh, honey, you're in the wrong end of the building. The elementary's down there. This is the junior high, you know. And so it was just, in every way, it was very difficult for me. But it came to me that I needed to read a page in the Bible every night. And before I would go to bed, and I would read another page in Mrs. Setti's textbook. And so in the textbook, I chose the chapter on footsteps of truth. And in the Bible, I chose the book of Isaiah. And I'll never forget this passage when I read it. Isaiah 54. The Lord God hath given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how to speak a word in season to him that is weary. He wakeneth my ear to hear as the learned. Behold, he will help me. And I think it was like somebody snapped their fingers and the animal magnetism broke of the shyness. And I even kind of forgot why I had started studying all that, but did it for months. And I would not go to sleep without reading a page in chapter Footsteps of Truth or something in Isaiah. And at the end of that school year, my friend said, you almost fell out of your chair when they announced the elections, but I was vice president of my class, cheerleader, president of the choir, and it was just like a 180-degree turnaround. So I was so grateful that God helped me understand that He had given me the intelligence for a reason, and chaplains are there to comfort people in the military, to bring that word of comfort from the scriptures to them. Now, when I got asked to go in the chaplaincy, I had given a testimony in a church at Iowa City where I was in graduate school. And the reader came up to me afterwards and he said, "I think you should go into the military chaplaincy." And I said, "Do we have one?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, do they let women do that?" And he said, "Well, I'm sure that's not going to stop you." And I said, "Okay." So I did interview with an Air Force chaplain, and I got a call from the mother church a few weeks later and saying they wanted me to come to Boston. And I didn't even know how to fly on a plane, so they had to explain to me how to do that. And I interviewed, and I got there, and this is how loving the mother church is. I didn't know enough, so I showed up in blue jeans and a halter top and sandals because it was 107 degrees when I left Iowa. And the three men who were interviewing were in three-piece suits, and I thought, I probably messed this up, So they were very loving, and they asked me why they thought that the reader there in Iowa City had said to me, "I think you should go into the chaplaincy." And I'd had an experience. I went to a reorganized Latter-day Saint church college because they gave me my tuition. And I was a senator in the House, and it was interesting to me because 20 years later I realized my nickname was Chaplain, even though I was the senator. And I wasn't reorganized Latter-day Saint. I'm about the only person on campus who wasn't. And I remember we wanted to do a dance, and so this woman said to me, "You need to contract this bluegrass band." So I said, "Oh, okay." And she said, I'll have to show you who the guy is in this band. And so I said, "Okay." And so we're in the student union. This guy walks in the back with another friend, and they're in Native American outfits. They've got the headgear, the feathers, everything, and they're jumping around. And she says, "Oh, that's the guy you want to do the bluegrass band." And I said, "Okay." So I walked over to him, but right as I did, the other man they were just joking around, but he slit the man's finger open and he was bleeding. And so I walked up to him and I asked him if I could pray for him and stop the bleeding. And we had never seen each other before, and he said, "Well, knock yourself out," gave me his hand. And so I took his hand in my hand and I prayed with a verse. My mother was dying of a hemorrhage when a Christian Science practitioner healed her instantaneously. And that verse was, "And I passed by thee, and I saw thee polluted in thine own blood. And I said unto thee, whence thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, I said unto thee, whence thou wast in thy blood, live." And that's Ezekiel 16:6. And the bleeding instantly stopped. And he was just kind of looking at his hand, and he said, "Well, okay, I'll do the music." So the night, a few weeks later when he did the music, on every break he'd come over to me and demand to know what I had done to him. And I kept that. Of course, we started talking about Christian Science. I explained to him how we studied a Bible lesson, showed him what Science and Health was, and even after the dance for an hour, he talked with me about Christian Science. And this was much like Prynne as a church college, because almost every single person lived on campus, but 5 or 6 people lived off campus there in an old house that was rickety, and they were not Christian Scientists. And so this young man shows up at my dorm, and this is way back in the dark ages when women had hours. So it was just 10:30 at night, and he demanded that I go with him to this place where he lived off campus. And I had to pray about that, but the voice in my head said, "This is that exceptional situation. You need to go with him." And so I went with him off campus, and he went to this house, and he began to take out of hidden compartments behind paintings on the wall or hidden compartments in the floor. He began to take out bags of drugs, and he piled them up on a table in the kitchen, and it was full of bags of drugs. And he'd give me lecture on this is hashish and this is marijuana and this is how they're different and here's peyote nuts and here's the danger with him, and he's giving me a lecture on them, and then he begins to tear the bags open and flush everything down the toilet, thousands of dollars of drugs. And he says, I want to know what you did to me. I have been a drug dealer since I was a Vietnam vet, and I don't know how I'll make my living anymore because I can't sell these drugs. Ever since you stopped the bleeding on my hand, I cannot sell these drugs. And I said, well, if you'll answer one question honestly, then I'll tell you. And I said, did you or did you not want to be free of this selling drugs? Took some time, and he said, well, yes, I did, but there's no way you could have known it. And I said, but God knew it, and he sent that situation and sent me to let you know. And what he had heard in that Bible passage was that he had wasted his life selling those drugs, and he decided that he could not do it anymore. Well, he was a Vietnam vet. And when the reader in Iowa City heard that, he said, you need to go be a military chaplain. So when I interviewed, I was very grateful, even though I came in the blue jeans and stuff. They felt that healing with this young man was something that indicated perhaps I could be a military chaplain. Well, of course, that idea of women being military chaplains was pretty new. And so I remember seminary was wonderful. You learned the human thought on things over at Boston University, but what we learned at the Mother Church with the metaphysical meetings was what truly prepared you for the military. I said when I went in the military, I've always said the first week was the hardest. And I was already concerned about going through basic training, and I in my whole life I've never been afraid of anything once I got through 12. And so it was just throwing me that I was afraid of going into the tear gas chamber. And so I prayed about what to pray about, and the thought came to me very clearly, you need to read the chapter on animal magnetism. And so as preparation to go into chaplain officer basic course, I read that chapter. I was going to read it every day for 2 months. That was my commitment. Well, I got so into it. I was just thrilled with it. And I kept thinking it's this tiniest little chapter in science and health and such an important topic. You know, why would she have it the shortest? And I must be missing stuff in there. So I was reading it sometimes 3-4 times a day. And I forgot why I even started reading it. I ended up reading it for 6 months. And the day I remembered why I started reading it was the day in basic training I was walking into the tear gas chamber. So it was interesting. There was an important sentence that had always stood out to me. And it's from page 103. I better get the right. Okay. Mind science is wholly separate from any halfway impertinent knowledge, because mind science is of God and demonstrates the divine principle, working out the purposes of good only. And my experience of that was that I was wholly separate from the experience of going in the gas chamber. It was kind of as if I were up here looking down on it. And our class was so large that, and you did this in alphabetical order, and my maiden name was Yarlot, so I was with the very last group going in of 200 and some people. And these were all prior service guys who helped out because the class was so big. And when we went in there, the infantry officers who were running the tear gas thing said, I know you prior service guys think you're going to get off easy, but we're really going to get you. So they took a lot more it's tear gas crystals and threw them on the fire, and you could just see the billows of tear gas coming up out of the fire. And I just remember we were supposed to stand there at a position of attention, and then they were going to tell you, okay, you have to say your name, your social security number, the state you grew up in, and this was to get you to breathe the tear gas. And when they did that, you took off your tear gas mask, because you wore it in to understand that, you know, it would protect you, but then they make you take it off, so you would never want to do that in any kind of gas. And so when everybody took it off, they'd put so much CS crystals in there, and it was so heavy that even the prior service guys panicked, and they were trying to get out the door, and they were all in a pile, literally. They couldn't see because of the so much was coming out of their eyes and everything, and the infantry guys were over there trying to pull them off and get them off of each other, and they finally got the door open and pushed the guys out because they couldn't see. And I'm still standing in there like this because they didn't give me an order to say my name and my social security number. So the infantry major came back in, and he had his tear gas mask on, and he looked at me and he goes, "Humor me and go outside." And I said, "Oh, okay." So I went outside, and then he took off his mask and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, you didn't have me say my name in there, And he goes, No. He said, "What were you doing in there?" And I said, "Well, I was praying." And he said, "Oh," he said, "are you a Christian Scientist?" I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Okay." But I had absolutely no reaction to that. I would often share that testimony wherever I went to, wherever I was stationed. And 22 years later, a woman came up to me after I shared that testimony, and she said, "Now, you do know that the name of the chapter is Animal Magnetism Unmasked?" I'd studied every iota of that thing, but I hadn't thought about the title. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting. That was the thing. So, what you find is that as you go through the military, you start out with the rank of captain because you're a professional officer. And so the first types of ministry that you do as a chaplain is what's called individual ministry. And so one of my favorite experiences was I was in Korea, and we were up on the DMZ, and we found out that Jane Robbins was going to come give a lecture. And we only got one lecture a year, and we'd have to go clear down to Seoul to the society that was there. And so I found my one Christian Science soldier, and we had this all planned how we were going to go down to the lecture. And about a month before the lecture, we found out that our huge warfighter exercise was going to be that week, and that we weren't going to be able to go. So I told him, I said, "We are not going to resent this. There's nothing that can deprive us from being part of that lecture." I said, "Wherever you are on the exercise, I will find you, and you and I will sit down and we'll read the lesson about the time that the lecture's going to happen." And he said, "Oh, okay, So sure enough, that day I found him, and they were doing a water crossing in their armored personnel carriers, and I got him at the other end, and we went up on this rock, and we're sitting there, and we just had opened our Bible in Science and Health, and this is back when you marked them. And this general came walking over the top of the rock and said, "Chaplain Horton, what are you doing?" And I explained, that there was this one Christian Science lecture a year, and it was going to start in a couple hours, and that we wanted to be a part of it, and we were reading our Christian Science Bible lesson. And he goes, and I mentioned that it was in Seoul, and he goes, "Oh," he says, "well, when does it start?" And I told him, in about an hour and 45 minutes. And he says, "Well," he says, "I'm flying to Seoul for a meeting. I got to be there for over 2 hours." And he said, "I got extra seats in my helicopter." And he said, "I'll fly you down there. You can get a taxi and, go over to the lecture and come back, and then we'll fly back down here." And I said, "Well, that would be awesome." And the private is standing there looking at this general, and he goes, "Oh," he says, "Sir, my sergeant would never let me go." And the general went like this, and he pointed at his star, and he said, "Oh, yes, son, he will." But that general so valued that was the one time a year that we could get to a Christian Science lecture, that he stepped in, and it would be very rare to be in a very important exercise like that and take somebody and fly him to Seoul. We got there, he landed the helicopter on the compound, and right as we landed, this car pulled up, and it was the Air Force Christian Science chaplain with his 2 Air Force guys. And we were able to get out of there, walk over, get in their car, and they drove us to the lecture at the society. And of course, now we're there with camouflage faces, and my private has his M16 rifle. And so Miss Robbins never batted an eyelash when 2 camouflage people came in and walked in and sat in the front row, and afterwards she came over and talked to the private, and she was just lovely. And so it was so beautiful to see how harmoniously that all went together. And then as soon as it finished, we hugged everybody and went over, and here was the general coming out of his meeting. We got back in the helicopter, and within about a 4-hour period, we were back at our exercise. So to me, it shows how Christian Science chaplains are going to rely on prayer to do their ministry. And so that's the ministry you do to the people of your own denomination, something along that line. There were also times that Christian Science chaplains will talk about that people do resist the idea that a Christian Scientist shouldn't be a chaplain. And so with me, as I said, I never quite knew whether it was the Christian Science edge or the woman edge or both at the same time, but I was in my advanced course and I'd come home from Korea, and we had a thing we had to go to, and so we had our formal uniform on and you had all your ribbons, and I'd only been in the Army for 4 years at that point, and I already had 2 meritorious service medals. And so I had them on my uniform, and this male chaplain walked up to me as we walked out of a big gathering of some sort, and he looked at me and he went, "You couldn't possibly have deserved those." And he spit on me. Now, whenever I share this experience, because as I quoted from Mrs. Setty's writings, when a new right idea is presented, sometimes listeners resist it. And so it was interesting that my initial response was a lot like a gas grill lighting up. And I had been a gymnast, and I could do 47 push-ups, so I was a little worried about how I might respond, but I knew I had to do it through prayer. And I just got very quiet, and the thought came to me from Science and Health: if you don't resist evil in the first instance, if you don't control evil in the first instance, it will control you in the second. I heard it as if you don't control evil in the first instant, because I knew I had to get myself in control that quickly. And I said, "Okay, Lord, I'm listening." And then the voice said, "The soldiers spit on Jesus." And that pretty much quenched it. And then the voice said, "When you said you wanted to follow me, did you think I meant in only the easy footsteps?" And I said, "No, Lord, if I have to follow you all the way to the cross, I'll follow you that far." And then he said, "What must a man have been through in order to be able to bring himself to spit on another human being?" So one of the things you learn in that military ministry is it's many times not about you at all. And I found myself reaching out and putting my arms around the man and hugging him and saying, "What must you have been through in order to be able to bring yourself to spit on another human being?" And I think the reality of what he had done hit him in the face like a brick. You could just see him go like that. Because I think it had been an emotional reaction to begin with, and I don't think he even kind of realized what he had done in such a hot moment. And when I hugged him and said that, he fell to his knees and cried and begged me to forgive him. And I said, "Well, of course I can forgive you." So when the idea of being a Christian Science chaplain, or for me, a woman and a Christian Science chaplain, kind of pushes against some of the other chaplains, then you find that that's an opportunity to heal something. And many people would say to me, "Who was that guy?" And I said, the other thing that occurred to me was I did not want to attach it to him in any way. I did not even want to see a face. And after that, I never even saw a face. And so you don't want to give a personality or an identity to anything that's erroneous. And I was just grateful that having gone through the beautiful training that we get at the Mother Church, we're prepared to, in some pretty dire situations, to do that. And so you're not going to give evil an identity. It's not a person, it's not a place, and it's not a thing. It's time, I guess, to put the duct tape on my mouth, but Um, I know that we wanted to have some questions and answers, and I've just given you the tip of the iceberg. So what we're going to do is, I guess we're going to stand for a moment. Is that right? And then if you have a question, you'll write it on your card, and they'll come get that. I'm going to start with the questions now. In the military, you always had a command, and so we thought it should be parade sit instead of parade stand. Okay. Okay. Someone asked the question, are there any other women Christian Science chaplains? Yes, there are several now. And it's interesting because there's not a lot of women chaplains in the military chaplaincy per se, but we have a number of women who are Christian Science, or have been and are Christian Science chaplains. And how many do we have now? That's kind of a complicated question. For many years, we had 25, 30 chaplains in the military. Then there was a board of directors that closed the military chaplain program for 15 years. And so there was 15 years that we had no one going in there. So when I was asked to restart it in 2006, then it takes 3 years of seminary and now 2 more years of post-seminary experience to even get the next person started. So we're just rebuilding that number of folks in the military. So we have 5 active duty and a reserve chaplain. We have about 5 or 6 more people in the pipeline, and they're at various stages. They've either got the seminary done and they're in the post-seminary experience, or they're still in seminaries. But we have a flow coming. It's just, it takes a while. When it takes that 5 years to get somebody ready, it takes a while to get that going again. Do chaplains pray? This is a good. Do chaplains pray for men on both sides? I don't know of any chaplain that I've ever talked with, whether it was a Christian Science chaplain or, and you could name, it could be a Muslim imam, it could be anybody, but it's very interesting in the military how closely people of different faith groups and different traditions work together quite lovingly. You'll find, like in anything else, there's a small percentage of people who are kind of fussy about that. But on the whole, what you'll find is the greatest percentage of folks work together very, very harmoniously. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. The Mormons asked me if I would fly out and train their new military chaplains. And part of that is because in the military, I was one of the people who, when they would try to do things to keep the Mormons out, because sometimes the people who try to pass the military regulations that change try to keep lay traditions out. And so when they actually had passed a new regulation that kept the Mormons out, I went to law, which is higher than military regulation. I went to U.S. law and showed the Mormon chaplain endorsing agent like me, here's what you need to take, and show them that they're in violation of law. And that's higher than the regulation. And they've never forgotten this. And so they asked if I would come out. And so this also answers another question that was in here, how have some of the other military chaplains who weren't Christian Scientists responded? And so 2 Mormon chaplains that were now training their chaplains were there, and that's part of why they asked me to come out. And one of the Mormon chaplains had worked for me for a year, and when you're in Germany and to drive 4 hours across Germany to get to where you're doing your activities, you're bored. And so he would tell me about Mormon tradition, and I would tell him about Christian Science. And then the next year I had a Methodist as my operations guy, and same thing, he would tell me about the Methodist Church, I'd tell him about Christian Science. And then I left and came back to the States, and I got a letter from him, an email from them, and they were very excited. And one of the things we talked about is they wanted to know, how did Christian Scientists do a prayer treatment? And so that was one of the things we talked about in detail. And the Mormon was at the door of a conference, and he saw the Methodist trying to come back in, and the Methodist could not walk on his leg, and he'd been running, and he'd stepped in a hole and twisted his ankle really badly. And so the Mormon that worked for me was trying to help him get in, and he said, oh, it looks like you can't even walk. And the guy says, I had a far easier sprain, and it was 6 weeks before I got back to running. And he says, this is going to be months. And the Mormon said to him, well, it's too bad Chaplain Horton's not here. She could have given you a prayer treatment and you'd have been healed. And the Mormon and the Methodist got to talking about how they used to talk about what a Christian Science prayer treatment was. And so they decided, well, maybe the 2 of them could get together and give him a Christian Science prayer treatment. And so the first thing the Mormon said to the Methodist guy, he says, now, that she'd ask you, what were you afraid of? And he said, oh, yeah, and he went into how, he feared about how bad that sprain was, and that it would take this probably months to get back to running. And he said, now, she told us that there's over 200 times that the Bible says, fear not, or don't be afraid. And so they, thought about that. And then the Methodist said, yeah, and she'd have asked me, what was I thinking about when I was running? And the Methodist said to the Mormon, he says, it was really bad. He said, I was priding myself on I was a chaplain and I could outrun those infantry operations guys I work with. And he said that pride was absolutely wrong, And so they went into this whole analysis, and within about 2 or 3 days, he was back running. And they wanted me to know that they felt they had learned enough to put together a Christian Science treatment for this wonderful healing of this chaplain's ankle. So partially because of that too, then the Mormon asked if I would come out and help train their new chaplains. So they're talking with them, and I'd shared some experiences I had. And one of the things that I shared with them was that I had recently gotten a call, and at the Marine Corps Depot at San Diego, and this is a good example of the chaplaincy and how you work together. Someone there, a drill sergeant, had taken a science and health away from a Christian Scientist who was going through his basic Marine training there. And they wanted me to call the senior chaplain at that installation and see if we couldn't work this out. And so I told the Mormons, I said, the very first question I asked that senior chaplain when I got him on the phone was, who else had sacred texts taken away? You never just are taking care of just your own people. And so I found out a Mormon had had the Book of Mormon taken away from him. A Muslim had had his Quran taken away from him. And there was a drill sergeant who had misunderstood in basic, you only have this little teeny locker. And so he had misunderstood. He thought the only thing someone could have was a Christian Bible. So he had taken anybody else who had anything other than a Christian Bible, he had taken these things away. And what is really wonderful is that in the military, that's why the chaplains are there. They're going to take care of everybody's religious needs. And so when I talked to that senior chaplain, I explained, the Muslim lost his Quran and the Mormon lost his Book of Mormon, and we really would love to have that Christian Scientist have his science and health as well. And he went right in and gave instruction to the drill sergeant, and immediately everyone had their sacred text given back. And so I'm going to explain this to you the way I did to the Mormons. As I said, you work with people of over 200 different Christian traditions, and then Buddhists, Muslims, you name it. And I said, what you find is that there's so many people who are, you meet them, and that night you go home and you say, wow, that guy or that woman's the real deal. They have the love of God in their heart. They love their soldiers or sailors or whatever, and they would do anything to make sure the religious needs of their people were taken care of. And I said, you just say that guy's the real deal. So at the end of the training, one of their new trainees was told that he was going to give me this little coin that the Mormons award people. And so he came walking up there and he goes, I'm brand new, I'm still in seminary. And he says, but ma'am, he says, we want to tell you, you're the real deal. So it was, but they felt how lovingly in the military chaplaincy, people don't just take care of their own folks. Oops, sorry. Oh, God. Oops. I can run 6 miles, but I can't keep this on my ear. Okay. Okay, one of the questions here is, are all religious groups allowed to have chaplains if other requirements are met? What you have to do is you have to do what's called registering with the Department of Defense. And so to do that, you have to meet certain requirements. And you don't even want to know those. It's just a military regulation. And it was interesting because the Wiccans wanted to have military chaplains. And recently the big issue has been atheists. And it was two things struck me. The atheists wanted to have a token representative. And so he was trying to get this through to the military. And he said, do you know, I've probably called 100 people, and you are the only person who would even talk to me. And so it was interesting. I then talked to some of the other people who at least got to the point where they could talk to him. But the religious leaders, as I said, there's kind of an edge on that. And I'm going to tell you what the difference was. And I shared this with some of the other people who were new, the Buddhists when they were new, and the Muslims when they were new, and everything. As I said, The difference for us, for me as a woman, was with other chaplaincies and other churches, they would say, well, you just have different beliefs than us. And when it was women being integrated, they at least could say, well, this is my human opinion, and that's your human opinion, if it was any other branch of the service. But the chaplains would be very quick to tell you, God told me you shouldn't be here. So they would have it took on an edge that was different than in any other branch of the service. So it's what you're realizing is that, again, that's why I called it the birth of a new idea. And many people said, well, the guy who spit on you, I had my tropical fish poisoned, I was run off the road by men in stocking masks. And it was interesting because people said, well, I can't even believe you continued. And I said, but so many of those people, at least they were honest enough to come to your face and tell you, I have a real problem with you. I said, many people were doing things behind your back and did not have the moral decency to even admit what they were doing. I said, what to me, the people who were the most pushing on you and coming up in your face and saying things, I said, at least they were honest. So you always want to recognize what are those spiritual qualities that they are exhibiting, and they were honest. And to me, that showed that at least their thought was receptive because they were wrestling with the idea, the way that Jacob wrestled. And so to me, I was looking at how they were being at least up front and not doing something behind your back. So again, that's part of why I relate this to the birth of a new idea. What denomination is Boston University? The Methodist Church founded Boston University, and they founded that seminary. But they have tons of people of different Christian traditions. They have other faith groups that attend seminary there. And the Boston University itself grants our students, I think it's about 30 to 40% of their tuition. So my sister, who is United Church of Christ, had to borrow so much money to do her seminary. She paid it off, her loans, the week she retired. So because of Boston University, they grant our students, our Christian Science students, 35% of their tuition. And then Boston University School of Theology grants them what it brings it up to almost 70% of their tuition. So that's how much value BU puts on us. And one day we were training over at the Mother Church, and they said, Boston University wants to come talk to you about your chaplain training program, because they were starting a new chaplain track at Boston University School of Theology. And would it be okay if we brought Dr. Porter over here? And I said, well, sure, we'll talk to anybody. And so they brought Dr. Porter over, and he said, I wanted to tell you, we'd been there almost 50 years at that time and using Boston University School of Theology to train our military chaplains and get that educational requirement. And he said, your church's candidates are superior morally. They have the intelligence beyond what we see in anybody else. And he just began to name spiritual qualities. And he said, we want to know what it is you're doing over here. And it was so interesting to me, the humility it must have taken for another church to say, we want to come over here and figure out why yours are so superior. So we sat, and he says, well, how would you teach, being a Christian Scientist, how would you even teach about something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder? And so I said, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to this book right here. And I put it down to him, and I said, let's think of a Bible story in here. And we went through 20 Bible stories. Daniel in the lion's den, Joseph, when his brothers stripped him and naked threw him in a pit and then sold him into slavery, and went through all the things that the Bible characters went through, what Paul went through. He was going to be thrown off a cliff and going to be stoned, and what Jesus went through. And we went through all the things that he could name in here. And I said, now, almost every one of those experiences, you would have said he had to have PTSD because, he was thrown in a lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown in a fiery furnace. They'd have to have PTSD. And I said, but the Bible doesn't record a single one of them having anything like that. And so what we went to is we studied those passages, and then we studied each thing that we could relate to, whether it was in the Psalms or anywhere in the Bible, that assured us that God is who cares for us and where true spiritual strength comes from. And I just gave him some of the ideas that we researched, and that was how we talked about that particular issue. And I shared with him that when we were in the Bosnian campaign, one of the things the Bosnians had said to me when I was down there was, "Oh, you Americans, you just are such weenies," you know. And they said, "We go through all this stuff and we don't come up with PTSD." You know? And so what they had been through in the Balkans was horrendous. And they said, "You know, we don't have people going through that." And so he was kind of interested that the Bosnians themselves had said that. So we talked, and there were some articles that were written on that. And so I said, you know, we really want them to understand what public thought is on it, but we really are going to go right back to this book. So there's quite a difference in how we train. Okay. Oh, I knew this would come up, the wild dogs. Okay. Again, 1977, us women had just been integrated for about a year. And one of the things military people do in the morning is they get up and they do their morning run. And so a bunch of us chaplains were at a very remote retreat center in Arizona. And the guys got up, and there were about 12 or 13, maybe even 15 other male chaplains, and they were going to go do their morning run. And I came down and I said, "Well, can I run with you?" And they said, "Oh, you'll never be able to make it." And I said, "Well, you know, how far are you going to go?" And they pointed out in the desert, and there was this little foothill, and they said, "It's about 2 miles out to the foothill. We're going to go around it about a mile, and then we're going to run back." And I said, "Well, I've been running 6 to 9 miles with my infantry guys each day, and so I think I can probably make it." And they went, "Oh, okay, fall in the back, and when you can't keep up, just fall out." So we go out there, and we're running out towards this little foothill. And we run and run and run and run and run and run. And finally, about 3 miles out, we realize we are no closer to that foothill than when we started. And we were not desert people, so we did not know the illusion of the desert. And we got to talking, yeah, maybe it's out there 20 miles, not 2. And so we realized we had to run back, so we flipped around to run back. And when I do really long distance running, I don't like to think about, okay, this is the 2,722 times that I've picked up my feet. So I was thinking about the morning Bible lesson was Caleb going in to spy out the promised land. And I was so struck, I was just wrapped up in thinking of this. I don't think I was seeing anything. I was just mindlessly running. But my thought was on the Bible story and how Caleb had the diametrically opposite view of the other people who were with him. They said, you know, we cannot go in there and possess that land. There are giants in there and it will kill us. And yet when he looked at that very same thing, he said, no, it's a land that flows with milk and honey. It will bless us and we can go in there and possess it. And so I'm thinking about that's so beautiful, a demonstration of mortal sense of something versus the spiritual sense of something. So I did not see the pack of coyotes coming. And the men saw the coyotes coming. It was probably a pack of about the same as them, 12 to 15. And they came running towards us. And the men, because they saw them coming, sprinted ahead. And there were 2 brick walls and 2 trees. And they were up in the trees and up on the brick wall. And so the coyotes circled me. And it was interesting, as they would circle, the lead dog would growl and he would tighten in. And when he tightened in, then the rest of the pack would tighten in, and then they would circle again. And he would growl and they'd tighten in and they'd circle. And I remember thinking how much I loved dogs. And I thought the only thing they can feel, they are a form of dog, is that I love them. And so I said, Lord, what should I do? And the thought came to me, you need to get down on one knee. And so, I get down to the coyote and I start talking to him like this. And when I got down on one knee like that and started to talk to him, he laid down. And when he laid down, the whole pack laid down. And then I started with, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that therein is. And he created the beasts of the field. And when I said that, I went like that to him, and he went. And And I explained to him that God divided the light from the darkness. And I went on to explain to him that God saw everything he made, and behold, it was very good. And when I went like that, he went, he's nodding his head. And I explained to him that God created him with a purpose, but it wasn't to harm me. And he created, I had a purpose and it wasn't to harm him, and he had a purpose and it wasn't to harm me. And he nodded his head again. And I said, but this isn't your right place. And I said, you need to get up and you need to go back out there where you belong. And he jumped up and he ran off, and all the coyotes ran off back into the desert. And then the men started coming down out of the trees. And now again, this is 1977, so the first guy kind of stepped up and he said, well, he said, we really didn't think women should be in the military. And the second one stepped up there and he said, no, he said, and we really didn't think women should be in the chaplaincy. And the third one said, and we don't like Christian Science. And then he says, but he said, if you can preach to wild dogs and they'll listen, I think soldiers will. So, and it was interesting because this was such an unusual experience. This story went throughout the chaplaincy. Wherever I'd go, people say, tell me about the coyotes. And so shortly after that, there were, by that time, 5 women chaplains in the Army, and they let us meet for the first time. And one of the women, back when women weren't allowed to be in the real military, she was what was called a WAC, a Women's Army Corps Auxiliary. And she'd gotten out, gone to seminary, and come back in now that women could actually be chaplains. She came back in as a chaplain. And she would always pride herself on she could drink any man under the table, and she was hardcore. And so Donna saw me, and she said, now, Janet, she said, were you in more danger from the dogs on the ground or the dogs in the trees? I said, now, Donna, I said, the reason I am here to tell you this is that I knew I was in no danger from his wonderful creatures on the ground, nor his beautiful children in the trees. She said, well, okay. But it's very interesting how differently that spiritual sense of something is versus the mortal or material sense of something. So the key to me in the chaplaincy was being very clear about the difference between the two. One more? Okay. Somebody talked about how would you pray about Syria. What I found was you worked with people from every background, and we were in one of the Bosnian parts of the campaign, and I think it was the Kosovo part. And we were having a video teleconference, and we had our general up in Heidelberg was on the video teleconference, and we had people from the United Arab Emirates there. And they were wanting to have a separate place, a separate chapel, what's called a containerized chapel. And it was interesting to me, the general who was on the video teleconference, and I've had to explain the chaplaincy to you in quite a degree today, and I haven't even touched the surface, but even the people in the military don't really get how it runs. And so the general was saying to the United Arab Emirates guys, you are in an American operation, and you're going to do it our way, and we have one chapel, and everybody comes in there to worship, and you're not having your own chapel. And you could just see the UAE guys like this, And so I stepped up and I said, sir, could I explain something to you? And I said, Allah cannot be worshipped at the same altar as any other God. And I said, even if you just restricted things to the 3 Abraham traditions, it would even be a little bit difficult. I said, but we have Buddhists come in there, we have Wiccans, we have people of every background, and Allah cannot be worshipped at the same altar. And when I said the prophet's name, if you say the prophet's name, because I was quoting him, you always say, peace be upon him. And I said that and explained the whole background. And I was very impressed because the general said, then we're going to get them their own containerized chapel. And to show you how far people's thought comes is as soon as that video teleconference stopped, every one of those UAE guys came over to me and they said, "We want to shake your hand." Now that's completely against their beliefs. And I said, "Oh no," I said, I completely understand and I understand your gratitude and everything. And they said, "No, we want to shake your hand." Now, even though that was against one of their beliefs, they wanted to cross that line because their gratitude was so great for someone not vilifying them. And they said, "Thank you for not vilifying us." And so just someone seeing them as having genuine religious needs and having genuine religious belief, and that perhaps it should be accommodated, was so striking to them that they crossed that distinctive line for them because they wanted to show their gratitude in an actual physical way. And it was interesting because I also briefed at Pace University on this terrorist mindset briefing that I do. And the thing I loved about that was I use quotes from the Monitor in it all the way through it. And no matter where I briefed, whether it was CIA, DIA, the Joint Military Intelligence School, National Security Council, you name it, they took me to brief in the entire Homeland Defense, everything. Everybody at the end would say, "I learned more from the Monitor, an open source, than I did from my classified sources." And so it was really neat to see the impact that the Monitor had on the people. And they even said that's one of the few, the UAE guy said, that's one of the few American kind of newspaper sort of things we'll read. So it was beautiful to see the recognition of the spirituality of what went into our work in the Monitor. So there, you found there was all these very interesting ways in which but what we have to offer is we have to offer a more truthful and a more loving and a more spiritual concept of the people in the world. And we don't dwell on what a small percentage, and that was one of the things in my briefing, was that extremists represent a tiny percentage of Muslims. And you can't vilify or you can't write off all Muslims because a small percentage. And they liked that I compared it to Christianity also had a problem with that tiny percentage of people taking that Abraham tradition and perverting it. At Waco, at Jonestown, and the restoration for the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments in Uganda, and they loved that I at least said, we're not the only tradition that's had a small percentage of extremists wrestle with that, and we're not responsible for what this tiny percentage did. So you don't want to vilify an entire major faith group for what a tiny percentage of people did. You want to pray still about its nothingness and that its only power is to destroy itself, because it's not either a moral or a spiritual power. It's a human, and it's something that's motivated by self-indulgences for different things. It has nothing to do with real religion. So I think it's time for the duct tape. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Janet, I knew that would happen. So thank you. What she didn't say is that Janet has a book coming out. And so what would you think that we invite Janet back to address us again, and then you can sign your book, Janet. Would that work with you? Okay. We'll plan on that. So thank you all for coming. We hope that you will join us on Sunday, December 4th. We have our annual Christmas celebration right here in the chapel auditorium. So we look forward to seeing you then. It'll be Desiree Goyette and her family. So we're looking forward to that. Once again, there's a tour leaving in about 15 minutes from the front desk. If you'd like to have a tour of Arden Wood, be happy to lead that. And thank you again for coming. And Janet, we just love you. Thank you.